Pausing after a big statement is one of the most powerful tools a speaker has, and it is also one of the most underused. When you say something that carries emotional weight, something like "today is the day" or "you are enough," the natural instinct for most speakers is to keep moving, to fill the silence, to rush toward the next sentence, because silence feels uncomfortable. But that discomfort is exactly where the power lives. If you rush past a big statement, you rob it of its impact. You tell your audience, without meaning to, that the words were not really that important. If you pause after it, you tell them the opposite. You tell them, "Sit with this, let it land. This matters." Think about it this way. When you drop a stone into still water, the moment that matters is not just the splash, it is the ripple that spreads outward afterward in silence. Your words are the stone, and the pause is the ripple. Without the pause, you only get the splash, and the ripple never has room to form. The audience needs that room. They need a few seconds of quiet to actually feel what you just said, rather than simply hear it and move on to processing your next sentence. There is also a physical, almost involuntary reaction that happens in a room when a pause is used well. People lean in slightly without realizing it. Their breathing follows yours. If you slow down, they slow down. If you hold still, they hold still. Silence, used intentionally, becomes a kind of invitation. It invites people to lean toward you instead of away. It invites them to ask themselves quietly, "What does this mean for me?" Now, how long should the pause be? There is no perfect formula, but as a general practice, count to 2 or 3 in your head before continuing. It will feel unnaturally long to you as the speaker because you already know what you are about to say next. Your mind has already moved on. But the audience has not moved on. They are still catching up to the weight of what you just said. That gap between your internal timing and their internal timing is exactly why the pause needs to feel, to you, slightly uncomfortable, slightly too long. If it feels just right to you, it is probably too short for them. It also helps to pair the pause with stillness in your body. Do not pace. Do not shuffle your notes. Do not look down. Let your eyes rest on the audience. Let your hands settle. Let your whole body say, "I am not moving on yet, because what I just said deserves a moment." This stillness reinforces the words themselves. It tells the room, without a single additional sentence, that something important just happened. One more thing worth remembering, the pause is not empty, even though it is silent. It is doing work. It is where transformation quietly begins to take root in someone's mind. You might say a line like, "One day is not tomorrow, one day is today," and in the 3 seconds of silence that follow, someone in that room is thinking about their own life, their own excuses, their own tomorrow that never came. That is not wasted time. That is the most important time in your entire speech. So, do not fear the silence. Use it. Wow! Trust it. Let your biggest statements breathe, and let your audience breathe with them. Speaking from personal truth is what separates a speech that people admire from a speech that people actually feel, and there is a real difference between the two. An admired speech is well-structured. It has good points. It flows nicely, but it stays outside the listener. It stays in their head. A felt speech gets underneath, that it reaches the place where memory and emotion live. And it does that because the speaker was willing to be honest, not perfect, not polished, honest. When you use the word "I," you are opening a door. You are saying, "This is not a lecture I am giving you from a distance. This is something I have lived, something I have carried, something that cost me." People can sense the difference between a speaker who is reciting an idea and a speaker who is remembering a moment. The voice changes even slightly. The pacing changes, the eyes change. That shift is not something you can fake for very long, which is exactly why it is so powerful when it is real. At the same time, the word "you" does something equally important. It pulls the audience out of their seats and into the center of the speech. When you say, "You have said one day, I'll change," you are not describing a stranger. You are describing the person sitting right in front of you, and their own private moments, their own version of that excuse rises up in their mind without you having to explain it further. You do not need to know their specific story for this to work. You only need to speak to the shape of the feeling, because most human struggles share the same shape, even when the details differ. This is why personal truth is not the same thing as oversharing. You do not need to tell your whole history. You do not need to expose every wound. Sometimes the most powerful personal truth is a single sentence, a small confession, something like, "I have stood exactly where you are standing, telling myself I would start tomorrow." That single sentence does more work than 5 minutes of general advice, because it proves you are not speaking from a textbook. You are speaking from inside the experience. There is also a kind of quiet courage required here, because personal truth means occasionally admitting you did not have it all figured out, that you failed first, that you doubted yourself, that you almost gave up. Many speakers are afraid of this. They think the audience wants to see strength only, but the opposite is usually true. People do not connect with perfection. They connect with recognition. They connect with hearing their own struggle reflected back to them through someone else's honesty. Strength that comes after struggle is far more convincing than strength that appears to have always been there. Using I and you together again and again throughout a speech creates a kind of rhythm of intimacy. It says, this is not me speaking at you. This is me speaking with you as someone who understands, because I have been there too. It turns a room full of strangers into something closer to a shared conversation, even though only one person is holding the microphone. So when you sit down to write, resist the urge to speak in abstractions. Resist phrases like people often feel or many of us struggle, and instead risk the specific, risk the personal, say what you actually felt, name what you actually feared, and trust that in your own particular truth, the audience will somehow find their own. Building rhythm with repetition is one of the oldest and most instinctive tools in spoken language. Long before there were speech coaches or communication classes, human beings were already using repetition around fires, in prayers, in songs, in the stories passed down from one generation to the next, because repetition does something that a single sentence, no matter how well crafted, simply cannot do on its own. When you repeat a phrase, something like one day, one decision, you are not just saying the same words twice for effect. You are building a kind of drumbeat underneath your speech, and that drumbeat becomes something the audience starts to anticipate, almost without realizing it. The first time you say it, they hear it as information. The second time you say it, they start to feel it as rhythm. And by the third time, they are no longer just listening to you. They are moving with you, the way a room moves together when music finds its beat. This is why repetition works so well right before a big emotional peak in a speech. If you say a phrase once, then build a small story or example, then return to that same phrase again, you are training the audience's ear to expect its return. And when it finally does return, it lands heavier than it did the first time, because now it carries everything that happened in between. The words themselves have not changed, but their weight has multiplied because repetition allows meaning to accumulate rather than reset. There is also something deeply reassuring about repetition. In a strange way, it mirrors how comfort itself works in real life. Think of a parent repeating "you are safe" to a frightened child. The words do not change, and yet each time they are spoken, the child settles a little more, because repetition signals certainty. It signals that this is not a passing thought, but a steady truth. When you repeat a phrase in a speech, you are essentially telling your audience, this idea is not going away. This is not one clever line. This is the center of everything I am telling you today. Repetition also gives an audience something to hold on to after the speech ends. People rarely remember every sentence of a talk, but they often remember the phrase that kept returning, the line that repeated itself until it became familiar, almost like a personal motto they can carry with them. If you want your message to survive past the moment you are speaking it, repetition is often the vehicle that carries it out of the room and into someone's daily life. That said, repetition only works when it is used with intention, not overused into background noise. Each time the phrase returns, it should arrive at a slightly different emotional point so that it feels like a familiar friend showing up again, rather than a broken record. Vary the pace around it. Vary your tone, sometimes soft, sometimes strong, and let the phrase itself remain steady, like an anchor, while everything around it shifts and builds. By the time you reach the end of your speech, that repeated phrase should feel less like something you said, and more like something the audience is now saying quietly to themselves, because true rhythm does not just echo in the room, it echoes afterward in the mind of everyone who heard it. Softening your voice for vulnerability and raising it for conviction is really about understanding that your voice is not just a vehicle for words. It is an instrument, and like any instrument, it can be played loud or soft, fast or slow, and each choice creates a completely different emotional experience for the person listening, even if the words themselves stay exactly the same on the page. When you lower your voice, when you let it soften almost to the edge of a whisper, you are signaling something very specific to your audience. You are signaling that what you are about to say is close to you, that it is tender, that it is not meant to be shouted across a room, but shared, almost privately, even in front of hundreds of people. A softened voice pulls people forward. It makes them lean in physically because quiet naturally demands attention in a way that loud rarely can. Think about how a room full of people, even a noisy one, tends to go still the moment someone begins speaking gently about something painful. That stillness is not an accident. It is the body's natural response to vulnerability. We quiet ourselves to protect the fragile thing being shared. This is why vulnerability should almost never be shouted. If you say something like, "I did not know if I would make it through that year," and you say it loudly, the words lose their believability because pain rarely announces itself with volume. Pain tends to live in the quiet, cracked places of a voice, in the slight unsteadiness, in the slower pace, in the breath that catches just slightly before the sentence finishes. When you allow your voice to soften naturally around these moments, you are not performing sadness. You are simply letting the truth of the memory shape the sound of your voice, and audiences can feel the difference between a performed emotion and a lived one. Then there is conviction, which asks for the opposite instinct entirely. When you rise into a statement of certainty, something like "today is the day you decide," your voice needs to carry weight. It needs to fill the room. Not with anger, but with belief, with the kind of certainty that makes people sit up a little straighter in their chairs. Raising your voice here is not about being loud for the sake of being loud. It is about matching the size of your sound to the size of the truth you are declaring. A quiet voice cannot convincingly deliver a call to action because conviction requires energy. It requires the audience to feel your own certainty pressing against the air in the room. The real skill, though, is in the contrast between the two, not in either one alone. If your entire speech stays soft, it becomes monotonous. It lulls people rather than moves them. And if your entire speech stays loud and forceful, it becomes exhausting, and vulnerability never gets the chance to breathe. But when you move deliberately between the two, soft for the confession, strong for the conviction, quiet for the memory, powerful for the call to action, you create an emotional wave that carries your audience up and down with you. That rise and fall is what makes a speech feel alive rather than flat, because you are not just telling people what to feel, you are letting your own voice model the feeling for them, moment by moment, breath by breath. End with a call to action, not just inspire. Ending with a call to action rather than just inspiration is the difference between leaving your audience feeling something and leaving your audience actually changed by what they heard. And that distinction matters more than most speakers realize, because inspiration alone, as powerful as it feels in the moment, has a way of evaporating almost as quickly as it arrived. People walk out of a room feeling moved, feeling uplifted, even feeling tears in their eyes, and then they get into their car, or they check their phone, or life simply resumes its normal pace. And within a day or two, that feeling has quietly faded. not because it was not real, but because it was never given anywhere to go. A call to action gives the emotion somewhere to land. It takes all of that stirred up feeling and channels it into something concrete, something the person can actually do the moment they leave their seat. And this is what separates a speech people remember fondly from a speech that actually alters the direction of someone's life. If you spend your entire closing simply reminding people how wonderful change feels, how possible it is, how much they deserve it, you have given them a beautiful feeling with no exit door, and feelings without direction tend to dissolve. This is why the ending of a speech needs to shift its purpose slightly. Everything before it can build emotion, can soften hearts, can raise conviction, but the closing needs to ask something specific of the listener. It needs to say, now that you feel this, here is what I want you to do with it. It does not need to be complicated. In fact, the simpler the action, the more likely someone actually follows through. Something like, before you go to sleep tonight, write down one thing you have been putting off, and do it tomorrow morning before you check your phone. That is not abstract. That is not vague hope. That is a door someone can actually walk through. A clear call to action also respects your audience because it assumes they are capable of doing something real rather than simply capable of feeling something real. There is a subtle kind of empowerment in being told, here is exactly what to do next, because so much of why people stay stuck is not a lack of motivation. It is a lack of clarity about the very next step. Inspiration says you can change your life, but a call to action says, here is the first move. And that first move is often the only thing standing between someone's intention and someone's transformation. It also matters that the call to action connects directly back to everything you built earlier in the speech. If your entire talk centered on the idea of one single day, then your ending should not suddenly ask for 100 small tasks. It should ask for one thing. One decision, one action, tied tightly to the theme the audience has been carried through for the last several minutes. This consistency makes the ending feel inevitable, like the natural final step of everything that came before it, rather than an afterthought tacked onto a nice speech. Finally, a strong call to action often works best when it is framed with urgency but not pressure. Urgency says, do not wait for the perfect moment. Begin now, while pressure would say you must, you have to, which tends to create resistance rather than movement. The goal is to leave people not simply admiring your words, but already quietly in their own mind, taking the first step you asked of them before they have even left the room. Bringing this all together, the speech, the powerful one-day plan to improve your life, is built on the idea that transformation does not require a perfect future moment. It only requires one honest day. Live differently, starting now. To deliver it well, each of the 5 techniques works together rather than separately. The pauses after big statements give the audience room to absorb the weight of what is being said, so the words are felt rather than simply heard. Speaking from personal truth turns the message from a lecture into a shared human moment, allowing the audience to see themselves inside the speaker's own honesty. The rhythm created through repetition, especially around a central phrase like one day, one decision, builds momentum and gives the audience something steady to hold on to and remember long after the speech ends. The shifting of the voice, softening for vulnerability and rising for conviction, mirrors the emotional journey of the speech itself, letting the audience feel the contrast between quiet reflection and bold declaration. And finally, closing with a clear call to action ensures that the inspiration built throughout the speech does not simply fade away, but is instead channeled into one specific doable step the audience can take the moment they leave the room. Used together, these elements turn a good speech into a memorable one, not because the language is fancy or the structure is complicated, but because it speaks honestly, breathes naturally, builds emotional rhythm, and ends by asking the audience to actually do something with what they have just felt. The heart of the speech is simple. Today is enough. This one day is enough. And if delivered with sincerity, pacing, and a clear final ask, it has the power to move people from merely feeling inspired to actually beginning to change.